Good morning, everyone. I was both delighted and honored to be asked to introduce this morning's Popcorn Forum keynote speaker, the Reverend David Ostendorf. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Mr. Ostendorf. I read his Vita and was so impressed by his work. David Ostendorf is a United Church of Christ minister, and he's currently serving as the director of the Center for New Community. He has been engaged for the past 25 years in organizing closely and working very closely with the nation's civic and religious community at all levels in the areas of human rights and justice. Now, the Center for New Community was established in 1995 in response to mounting social, economic, and racial injustices wrought by contemporary political economy. It's committed to revitalizing communities through faith-based organizing initiatives and programs, and it works throughout the Midwest to counter organized hate group activity. From 1981 until 1993, the Reverend Ostendorf served as Executive Director of Prairie Fire Rural Action, a rural education, training, and organizing group based in Des Moines, Iowa. Now, this organization was committed to revitalizing family farm agriculture. Prior to his Iowa-based work, he served from 1979 to 1981 as the director of the National Rural Energy Development Education Project for Rural America Incorporated in Washington, D.C. And then he served as associate director for the national organization. Mr. Ostendorf's ministry began in the coal fields of southern Illinois, where from 74 to 79 he was co-founder and staff member of the Illinois South Project, a rural education and organizing group focusing on coal and energy development impacts, agricultural land preservation, and utility rate organizing. The Reverend Ostendorf has over 50 articles published in newspapers and magazines and books. He has written on contemporary social and economic issues. These articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Christian Century, the Progressive, and some of you may be familiar with Gonzaga's new publication called the Journal of Hate Studies, and the Reverend Ostendorf has an article in that first issue. Mr. Ostendorf holds a Bachelor of Arts with high honors from Elmhurst College, a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York, and a Master of Science from the University of Michigan, where he was a National Science Foundation Fellow. In 1987, he was awarded the Honorary Doctor of Divinity by Elmhurst College. The Reverend Ostendorf was recognized by Esquire magazine in 1984 as one of the best of the new generation of leaders changing America. In 1990, he received the Iowa Farmers Union Humanitarian Award for service and dedication to family farmers. From 1991 to 1993, he was a participant in the Hartford Seminary Leadership Education Program. In 1995, the Louisville Institute for the Study of Protestantism and American Culture awarded him a research grant for religious leaders for his continuing work on the role of the rural church in America. In 1997, he received the Distinguished Service to Rural Life Award from the Rural Sociological Society. What a list of accomplishments. I'm sure you as eager as I am now to hear from the Reverend David Ostendorf. Please join me in welcoming here to NIC's Popcorn Forum.
Good morning. It's good to be with you this morning, and I want to thank all of you for the opportunity and the invitation to join you and for your taking the time to be here at this presentation this morning. And afterwards, if you'd like to stick around and visit with me, I'd be more than happy to do that if we have some time. I want to thank Tony and all the people who have been instrumental in organizing the forum this year and all these many years. It's an important event, and especially this year's events are critical in terms of how we continue the battle where we are in our lifetimes to counter hatred, which is still, as we all know, painfully alive and well here and across this nation, and indeed growing across the world. I cut my teeth, if you will, on countering hatred during the 1980s. During that time, as was mentioned in the introduction, I was organizing with farmers across Iowa and across the Midwest during that very difficult economic crisis in agriculture. And in about 1984, 1985, many of the farmers we were working with began to come to us and say that they had attended this or that meeting at which they learned that, in fact, it was the Jews who were attempting to take their land. It was the Jews who were behind the international banking conspiracy to raise interest rates and to deprive farmers of a living. It was the Jews who were behind, of course, everything. And we, of course, began to become very concerned about that situation. And it became increasingly clear to us that there was an increasing incursion, an increasing movement of this ideology into the Midwest and Plain States. And then during the entire 1980s, from that point on, our organization and many others, churches, organized labor, and many other groups, took it upon ourselves to form coalitions wherever we possibly could to educate and train and organize people to counter this movement. In the Midwest, in Canada, we did presentations all over the nation, in fact, about this movement, and by the end of the 1980s, it, thank goodness, had pretty much dissipated once again. But we had people coming into the region, into the Midwest, as you were experiencing the situation out here in northern Idaho with the Aryan nations. We had people coming in from all over the South and from the Northwest as well, trying to expand this base of support for this kind of ideology that put white people at the center and at the top of all the political and economic and religious constructs that they could come up with. And people who were coming in trying to encourage farmers to take up the gun to fight this conspiracy of Jews and others who were allegedly responsible for this crisis in the countryside. At that time, we were becoming more aware ourselves of the ideology that is called Christian identity, and the ideology that has really been at the heart of the white supremacist movement in this nation for many years, and that was really centralized in many ways right here at the Aryan Nations compound. The compound here served as one of the great seed beds, if you will, for the spread of Christian identity, theology, and ideology during the 1980s and before that as well, and certainly into the 90s. And so as we began to encounter this movement in the 1980s, and then as it came back with such force by the mid-1990s in the form of the militia movements, we became increasingly concerned about the nature of Christian identity theology and how it was the seedbed and the framework, the very foundation of this movement in the nation. And we began to do quite a bit of work to understand this theology a lot more in a lot more depth. And we began to work across the nation with the religious community, and especially the Christian community, to help them understand that they had a fundamental responsibility to take on this kind of ideology, to stop it, to address it, to counter it, because it was such a heresy of Christian thought and Christian beliefs. And so this morning I've been asked to talk with you about Christian identity theology, and it's based as the foundation for the white supremacist movement in the United States. And I'm going to do that by really starting way back over 160 years ago to help us understand the framework and the context for what this theology stands for, how it was manifested right here in the Coeur d'Alene area, up the Aryan Nations compound, and how it has driven and continues in many ways to drive the white supremacist movement in America. Simply put, Christian identity theology is an understanding that salvation comes only by race. Okay, salvation by race. Forget it. If you're a Christian, forget this notion of salvation by grace. Take the G off, and it's salvation by race. That's what it's about. And salvation by white race. If you're white, you're saved. If you're not, well, you don't have a chance, basically. Now, Christian identity theology traces its roots back to 1840 in Scotland. There was a man by the name of Jonathan Wilson in 1840 who wrote a book called Our Israelitish Heritage. Our Israelitish Heritage. Or Origins, I'm sorry. Our Israelitish Origins. And what Jonathan Wilson proposed was that the 10 lost tribes of Israel had emigrated up through the Middle East, up through Europe, and across the Caucasus Mountains, and eventually landed in Great Britain. And so in short, what Jonathan Wilson did was to make the British, the Scots, all of the folks who inhabited the isles there, he basically made them the chosen people of God. Now, as preposterous as this may seem, you have to remember that during this period in the 19th century, the 1840s on, this was a period of British imperialism. It was a period in which the British, in fact, did rule much of the world, as it were. It was a period when scientists, philosophers, theologians, and many others in the academy were positing the notion that white people were superior to all other peoples. And so there were tremendous scientific rationales put forth, for example, that claimed that white people were superior by all sorts of strange measurements. You know, there was a whole phenomenon during this period and so on that measured head size and cranium size and brain size to prove that white people were superior to all other peoples. And so Jonathan Wilson's proposition about the people of Great Britain was not particularly that far askew from a lot of other thinking that was going on at that point in time. Well, Wilson's ideas were really crafted by way of a lot of language deconstruction. He took Hebrew and other ancient languages and kind of showed how if you deconstructed them, they were essentially English words. He tried to show the relationship between the British monarchy and the monarchies in the Bible, and thereby prove again that the British were obviously inheritors of the promises of the people of Israel. And so Wilson's ideas really became kind of a social movement in Great Britain in the 19th century. And one of his disciples, a man by the name of Edward Hine, kind of took up Wilson's cause, as it were. And by the mid-19th century, there were groups called Anglo-Israelitish associations. There were 27 of them scattered around Great Britain. And by the late 1880s, Hine actually leaped the Atlantic and brought British Israelism, which it became known as by that time, British Israelism, he brought to the United States of America. He spent 4 years here from 1884 to about 1888, and really continued to spread this kind of ideology, this kind of thinking on American soil. Well, when he got it here, of course, a lot of racists who were here had a natural affinity for this kind of thinking. After all, it sort of gave them theological foundations for what they believed anyway about peoples of color. And so it wasn't long until this notion of British Israelism began to kind of take a different shape on American soil. And one of the people who made that happen, one of the people most responsible for the development and the spread of British Israelism, which eventually became Christian identity, was none other than Henry Ford. Henry Ford, the automaker, was a vile anti-Semite. He hated Jews. And Henry Ford took up British Israelism as part of his worldview, which fit perfectly into his notion about Jews. And Henry Ford began to promulgate these ideas through a newspaper which he ran called the Dearborn Independent. And obviously he had wonderful marketing opportunities through all his Ford dealerships across the country. And the Dearborn Independent became one of the key mechanisms, through his dealers and other ways by which British Israelism became spread across the United States. Henry Ford even published in the Dearborn Independent the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, the Protocols is an infamous Tsarist Russian forgery that has come down through the ages and just won't die. It is a publication that blames Jews for virtually everything that is wrong in the world, that blames Jews for trying to develop and cultivate this international banking conspiracy, this whole effort to essentially control world governments and world economic systems. It is a publication that you can find to this day on tables in white supremacist meetings. It is a publication that right now is one of the most popular publications in the Mideast, being spread by Islamicists who really want to undermine the state of Israel. It is a publication that just has 100 lives, and it just will not go away. Henry Ford published this in the Dearborn Independent, and thereby began to lay the foundation for British Israelism in the United States. Ford was a man who, as much as he contributed to the industrialization of America, of course, his contributions toward hate in America have often gone unspoken and unrevealed. There have been some recent publications and books that really looked at this situation with Henry Ford, and if you would want to take a deeper look at that, I would certainly suggest you look at some of those recent publications and books. Well, Henry Ford also had a disciple, a follower by the name of William Cameron, and Cameron sort of took up this mantle himself, just as Edward Hine had done with Jonathan Wilson, and Cameron started in this country a whole movement, and he promulgated British Israelism as far as he could throughout the organized racist movement in America anyway. And it began to kind of take shape as the ideological framework for the white supremacist movement in this country. It wasn't until after World War II in 1946, however, that British Israelism really began to take shape as Christian identity, if you will, in this country. And that happened under the leadership of a man by the name of Wesley Swift. And Wesley Swift was the son of a Methodist pastor who formed a church in California called the Church of Jesus Christ Christian. Sounds familiar? Hayden Lake, Aryan Nation, was Church of Jesus Christ Christian, Aryan Nation. Wesley Swift founded this church in California in 1946. And Wesley Swift began to promulgate these kinds of beliefs, this kind of ideology that would provide him and other racists a stronger theological foundation for their belief systems. Now, Wesley Swift had two heirs from his church in California. One of them was a man by the name of William Potter Gale. And William Potter Gale was a person who began to be active in Swift's church and began to promulgate new ideas that took identity to a different level. William Potter Gale was actually the founder of the Posse Comitatus, which some of you may have heard of. The Posse Comitatus was an organization of people who believed that the ultimate power of government lies only at the county level, that there is no higher power of government than the county, and that people had a right and indeed responsibility to make sure that there was no higher level of government than the county. And so the Posse Comitatus began to meld a lot of these kinds of racist ideas with this kind of foundational anti-government fervor and hatred of government. And the Posse became one of the primary organizations by which these ideas of white supremacy combined with an intense hatred of government began to spread in the 1970s and 1980s throughout the nation. In the Midwest and Wisconsin, the Posse was very active during that period of time, as they were in many parts of the country. and the posse became one of the primary arms by which these kinds of racist ideologies were spread throughout the nation by people who were disgruntled and disaffected from government, and who may be suffering from economic problems themselves, and who had a penchant for hating government anyway. So Gale began to put a real systematic theological framework around Christian identity. In 1963, he published a book called Faith of Our Fathers, and that really began to put all the structure into this kind of ideology that became known as identity. And Gale was really one of the primary people following Wesley Swift, who was responsible for the continuing spread and development of this ideology across the country. If you really want to look at more information about William Potter Gale, there's a wonderful new book put out by one of my former staff members, Denny Levitas, called The Terrorist Next Door. It's been out about 2 months. It's actually been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and it's an extraordinarily good book about William Potter Gale and the whole posse movement and the militias into the contemporary period. The other disciple that Wesley Swift developed was none other than Richard Butler, who became head of the Aryan Nation. And Butler was a Swift disciple as well. And he left California in the 70s and came up here to establish the Aryan Nation compound, and from there began to, as I said earlier, grow this kind of ideology and this theological foundation for the white supremacist movement from essentially from the 80s to the present period of time. And Butler, again, while Gale really kind of put the theological and the ideological framework around identity, Butler kind of took it to, he used all of that framework and then took it to the level of the anti-government and the kind of seeding of hate that he was responsible for during all the period in which he was based here at the Aryan Nation compound. Probably more than anybody else, Butler and the people who were drawn to the compound here were responsible, I believe, for the continuing spread of hatred and white supremacist notions in this country for the last 20 years. And they were very adept and very successful at doing this. Any self-respecting racist in America who had not been to the compound here just hadn't quite cut it yet. And it was a seedbed for so many violent activities that took place, especially during the 1980s. Many of you know the Order, the Silent Brotherhood, if you will. While not particularly identity-driven, Robert Matthews and his followers came here to the compound, were, in a sense, nourished by this kind of ideology and this kind of thinking, particularly the anti-government element of it. And Robert Matthews and the Order from 1982-83, that period in time, established what became one of the first domestic terrorist organizations identified by the federal government in this nation. And they spread terror and hate and murder throughout the West. They killed a Jewish talk show host down in Denver. They robbed numerous armored trucks and banks around the Northwest. And it's thought that they eventually got away with upwards of $3 million that was never really found and is assumed to have gone into the white supremacist movement in various places across the nation. And so the Order became one of the most violent manifestations of this ideology and had deep roots here and deep grounding within this kind of ideological framework. Other groups during that period of time were similarly grounded in this kind of ideology. Throughout the Midwest in the 1980s, we had survivalist camps in southern Missouri and Arkansas, the camps that were armed to the teeth for the coming fight of Armageddon against the Zionist-occupied government of the United States. Their notion was that Jews controlled the entire government and that there was a necessity to bring violent destruction to this Zionist-occupied government of the United States. And so that whole period of the 1980s was extraordinarily turbulent and extraordinarily dangerous in many places across this country, and particularly for people of Jewish descent, and particularly for persons of color. And the period was one of extraordinary threat to so many people across the nation. What drove this kind of theology, and I want to really focus on the theological foundations of Christian identity for a few minutes, because I think it's very important for us to understand that. There's some foundational principles for identity theology that are critical to understand. First of all, there is an understanding that God created Adam as a white man, and that God, before Adam, had created other peoples who were called mud people. You understand the racist connotation there. People of color. They were pre-Adamic peoples. They were less than human, if you will. And so this notion that Adam was God's created man, and a white man at that, is one of the foundational principles of identity theology. And understanding that from Adam come all other peoples who are of God, if you will, that is, white people. All other peoples of color are subhuman. Some identity proponents call people of color beasts of the field, and it kind of goes downhill from there. Some of the most racist, vile language and depictions of peoples of color can be found in identity literature that you would ever find anywhere on the printed page. A second belief is that Jews are children of the devil. Now, this belief comes from an understanding that Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, when Eve was basically tricked by the serpent in the Garden of Eden, identity understands that Eve and the serpent had a sexual liaison out of which came the children of the devil, i.e. the Jews, literally. Now, as preposterous as this may seem, that is a foundational principle of identity theology. And so, again, you see that all white people and all people who aren't Jews are the literal descendants of God. They look at the Hebrew word for Adam, Adam, A-D-A-W-M, which they translate as meaning blood in the face, and which, you can only allegedly see blood in the face from white people, okay? And so, again, more of this kind of word deconstruction happens even in the foundational principles of identity theology. Virtually everything else in identity theology goes from those foundational principles. And you can see then that these are the grounding principles of this kind of a hard racist understanding, this hard anti-Semitic understanding of the human race. And it was upon these principles then that identity proponents began to promulgate and help people frame their understandings about why white people were allegedly superior. If you can go to the Bible, as it were, and prove that you are superior through these kinds of ideological, jumps through all kinds of hoops, then you can really, if you believe that, then, it doesn't matter who else you might be, poor or anything else, you're superior. You're superior. And that's what drove Christian identity theology all these many years. It's also important to understand that, again, taking up the original understandings that Jonathan Wilson had about Christian identity of the people of Israel emigrating up through Europe and landing in Great Britain, it's important to understand then that what identity did in this country was to say that the British people then moved, of course, from Great Britain to North America. so that white people in North America are the true inheritors of the promises of God. So they kind of stole Jonathan Wilson's idea about the British, reframed it and repackaged it within a North American context and said, well, white Christian Americans are the true people of Israel. And so there's this kind of nuance now that's important to understand here too, because white people are seen as the true Israelites. They're not Jews, okay? Jews are these mongrel people who were of the tribes that stayed in the Mideast. They are the devil's children and so on and so on. The true inheritors of the promises of God given to the 10 tribes of Israel who went to Great Britain allegedly, then came to the United States. These true promises of God are to white people, the true Israelites in the United States of America. And so today, Christian identity is known in many different, by a number of different names, and oftentimes it's Israel identity, and there are other names to kind of shift away from some of the worst aspects of the racist and anti-Semitic foundations that have become known to most people in this country in the past 10 to 15 years. So what did they do? They took what I call the name game that Jonathan Wilson engaged in back in the 19th century. They took that name game and began to take it to a different level. So, for example, Isaac's sons, okay, Isaac and the sons of Isaac. Isaac's sons became Saxons, okay, white Anglo-Saxons, okay. They were Isaac's sons. London, London, was a city that was of the tribe of Dan, D-A-N. When the British formed London, they just changed the A to an O, okay? And Denmark was a nation of the people of the tribe of Dan, okay? Even the word Scandinavians is a derivative, they say, of Scandinavians, okay? So these kind of complex and interesting word games have been another foundational piece of how they've essentially proved, if you will, that white people, the British, Americans, are indeed the true inheritors of the promises of God. Now, what do they say about Jesus? Well, there again, there's a lot of very interesting kinds of twists and turns they take to show that Jesus was an Aryan. For example, again, they say that Jesus was not a Jew. Jesus was an Israelite. Okay, Jesus was one of the inheritors of the promises. He was white. Jesus said many times in the Bible, Jesus is quoted to say, "I came only to save the people of the house of Israel." Okay, some of those quotes you may know. And so again, they take that as to say, well, Jesus came only to save those of us who are the house of Israel, i.e. white people, i.e. white Christian people. Now, one of the more interesting things they've done to show that Jesus was an Aryan was to pick up on what has been, for I guess many generations, a legend in Great Britain that talks about Jesus' uncle Joseph of Arimathea, who allegedly owned tin mines in Cornwall in England. And so what identity has done is basically say, well, if Joseph of Arimathea owned tin mines in Great Britain, it makes sense that he probably took nephew Jesus along on some of those trips to Great Britain. And thereby they show that Jesus was, in fact, during all those years of his life not covered in the biblical story and accounts, that Jesus was in Great Britain, working with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea around the tin mines in southern Great Britain. And thereby, again, proved Jesus' white heritage, his Aryan heritage. So there are many twists and turns that they take to, again, show that this is the true piece of reality that essentially defines Jesus in their understanding. Now, these may seem preposterous, and yet they are basic principles that have driven Christian identity theology these many years. They are basic principles that have undergirded the white supremacist movement in this country for these many years. And identity theology for at least the past 20 years has really been the theological glue, the ideological glue holding the white supremacist movement together. Now, as in many cases with these kinds of movements, there are differences of opinion here and there, there's fights among each other about which is the truer aspect of the belief system and so on. But the foundational principles all remain the same. And again, that's salvation by race and an understanding that white people, white Christian people, are the chosen people of God, the true inheritors of the promises of God given to the people of Israel. That's the bottom line. And that's the bottom line that continues to drive much of this movement. Well, what were the other outcomes of this movement? I talked about the 1980s. In the 1990s, what began to happen is that after the incident at Ruby Ridge and other things that happened that disturbed many of the white supremacists, a Christian identity pastor by the name of Pete Peters from LaPorte, Colorado, called a meeting of, quote, Christian men that was held in Estes Park, Colorado in 1992. And at that meeting, over 150 of the nation's leading white supremacists gathered. Some of the most hardcore of the haters in America gathered at that meeting in Estes Park and formulated a new responses by which the movement would react to other kinds of potential government incidents like Ruby Ridge, and then after Waco, that gave them more fuel for the fire, if you will. And at Estes Park, they developed a variety of different ways by which they would respond as a movement. One was the Sacred Weapons and Tactics Committee, the SWAT Committee. And out of that committee and other conversations there was born, really, the militia movement of the 1990s. After the Estes Park meeting, the militia of Montana, under the leadership of John Trockman, who's just not very far from here in Montana. John Trockman is hardcore Christian identity. He's been to Aryan Nation compound here. He espouses his Christian identity beliefs. John Trockman established the militia of Montana, which, of course, by 1997 resulted in the Freeman standoff. Militias were cropped up all over the nation. The Michigan militia, virtually every state in the country during that period from about 1994 to 1996 and 7, virtually every state in the country had a militia movement. And during that period of time, we and many other people and groups across the country were basically saying that this militia movement is grounded, is rooted in Christian identity theology, which it was. And while many people who got caught up in the militia movement were not identity themselves, there's no question that much of the tasks that we had in that period of time was to try to separate people out from the hardcore racist and anti-Semitic ideology that was driving the militia movement. There were some well-intentioned people who became part of the militia movement, but at heart, it was an identity construct. And in 1995, after Oklahoma City, however, the militia movement began to wither. Timothy McVeigh was a person who had been indirectly influenced under identity, although he was much more influenced by William Pierce, who was until his death last summer the leading neo-Nazi in the country. And Oklahoma City really began to put a damper on the militia movement. People really, I think, many people in the militia movement itself began to see what the potential was for this movement and began to shy away from it. But others, I think, too, that the movement really just began to fade because people were so, the government really began to clamp down pretty heavily in that period of time as well. So Christian identity and the militia movement were of one foundation in many ways. And that's really been, in the contemporary period, in the most recent period, that's, the militia movement has been one of the more more national manifestations of identity, if you will. Since 1997, 1998, and then the demise of the Aryan Nation compound, identity has kind of begun to, shall we say, fade a little bit. First of all, its leaders are aging. Butler and many of its other leaders are fading and old. However, you still have groups around the country. Right here in Idaho, Dave Barley and his American Promises Ministries up at Sand Point. Many other groups across the country in the Midwest. We have Dan Gaiman and his church and compound down in southwest Missouri. Pete Peters is, as we call him sometimes, Pete Peters from Colorado is kind of the Johnny Appleseed of hate. He goes all over the country holding seminars and Bible camps and trainings. We have to deal with him in Wisconsin every year. We have to deal with him at the end of May on Memorial Day weekend, again this year down in Branson, Missouri, where he will hold one of his big weekend gatherings, probably with over 300 people present. And so as much as the ideology and the theology is somewhat at a status quo point, if you will, there are still many of its purveyors and its backers and its promoters working the countryside all across this nation. Where it goes from here is just an unknown. But the reality is, and our concern is always that this identity theology, this ideology is always they're always looking for new and younger leaders. And once they find those new and younger leaders, the potential for the theology to take on new kinds of manifestations and new kinds of outgrowths is always there. And we've seen all over the country what a small group of people can do in terms of their impact and in terms of the kind of influence they can have on a lot of people and on the kind of development of a movement that has extraordinarily and potentially violent outcomes against peoples of color, against Jews, and many others. So our concern is always, even though the movement at this point in time is somewhat at a status quo, our concern is always to make sure that communities are speaking up, speaking out, and acting to counter the influence of this kind of ideology. Today, however, we're increasingly concerned as a result of this kind of fading of Christian identity, though again, I want to make sure you understand it's not going away. But what's happened today is that the whole white supremacist movement has sort of taken another shift shape. And much of the power and the most influence of the white supremacist movement is now found in places like the National Alliance, which is one of the leading neo-Nazi organizations in the country, and which has become one of the most dangerous groups in the country. Founded by William Pierce, as I said, who died last summer. William Pierce was a PhD physicist who took over the National Alliance, who several years ago bought out a group called Resistance Records. William Pierce made a move within the last 5 years to really capture the power of white power music that was, leaped the Atlantic from Europe, from the fascist movement in Europe to the United States in the late 80s and early 90s. And so white power music for youth has been one of the most effective and frightening recruiting tools out there. As some of the white power adherents say, you know, I can give a kid a brochure and he'll read it once and throw it away. I can give him music, he'll listen to the CD 20 times, and by the 20th time he's got the words down. And some of the white power music that exists in this country at record shops all across the country, online or through Resistance Magazine, again, some of that is the most vile, racist, and anti-Semitic music you'd ever imagine hearing in your lifetime. So our organization has taken a lot of effort in the last 4 years to 5 years to really expose white power music, to organize youth, particularly in the Chicago area, to counter the impact of white power music, to get it off its shelves. We worked in partnership with the Northwest Coalition for Human Dignity out here to work with youth all over the Northwest and as many places as we can to help them understand the influence and the potential power of white power music in youth cultures. We've started an internet radio station for youth to help them, to help really kind of undergird a different kind of youth culture. And we're working every way we possibly can with schools and school administrators and doing peer group youth organizing to counter the impact of white power music. But the National Alliance, in spite of that, continues to grow. In spite of Pierce's death, it continues to be one of the most influential of the white supremacist organizations in the country today. The other aspect of a newer manifestation of this movement today is in the anti-immigrant movement. And this is perhaps one of the more dangerous outcomes of this movement in recent years, because in fact this new phenomenon, relatively new phenomenon, is one that doesn't wear brown shirts or white hoods. It's one that comes in shirts and ties and walks in the halls of Congress. It really is an effort to shut down America's borders to all immigrants, and particularly after September 11th, it has grown in power and voice, and it's particularly aimed at shutting down America's borders to persons of color who are immigrants, and is imbued with a fear that infuses the entire white supremacist movement, a fear that indeed white people in this country will be a minority by the mid part of this century. And so there's this sense that white people are losing power and voice and influence, and that white people have to do everything they possibly can to make sure that they maintain the base of power that they have in this nation. And so the anti-immigrant movement is a mainstream movement. It's well-funded. It's well-recognized in Washington, D.C. It's doing work across the country to really try to stop immigration and to, again, foment dislike and hatred for peoples of color in particular. We're dealing with it in the Midwest, in Iowa, in Minnesota, in Nebraska. It's obviously all over the border areas down in Arizona, where, in fact, many vigilante groups are now being organized to try to stop immigrants from coming in. And where the infusion of white racist organizations and sort of these mainstream groups is happening in those kinds of areas. So I think the bottom line here for folks from northern Idaho is that, well, the Aryan Nation has been really a focal point of concern here for so many years, and rightly so, and where finally it has collapsed. It's important to understand as you look ahead here in northern Idaho that, as one of my staff members said, you know, don't just look at the Aryan Nation or only at Christian identity. He said it's kind of like if you're always looking at the Aryan Nation as the problem, even though it's essentially kind of gone, although, as I said, we know it's not all gone. If you're only looking at that, it's like driving down the road looking in your rearview mirror. And if you do that, you know what's going to happen. You're going to drive off the road. You're not going to see what's ahead. You're not going to see the peripheral vision of what's on the roadsides. And that peripheral vision will give you a sense of the new manifestations of white supremacy in America that are developing as we speak. And so, you know, as you move ahead, as you drive down the road, as it were, look out the windshield and don't just look in the rearview mirror at the Aryan Nation or at Christian identity, because new waves of racism and anti-Semitism are shaping up and taking shape all the time, all around us. And it's critical that you understand that, and that you're always open and creative about understanding and responding to this movement, because it's a movement that in this country just does not go away. And it's a movement that simply because the Aryan Nation compound has been shut down, it has not gone away. And it won't go away. And it's alive here, it's alive in every state in this nation. It's manifested in many different ways, but it's a reality. And it's a reality because people are in this nation, you know, we grow up, if you're white in this country, you grow up with a culture of whiteness that basically, even though you may be a very solidly anti-racist person, we all grew up in a culture as white people that really makes it difficult for us to shed all of those kinds of racialist feelings. If you grew up in this country as a Christian, you carry with you a baggage of anti-Semitism that goes from the biblical story up to the present time. I mean, just 2 weeks ago it was that a U.S. representative from Congress got up at a rally, an anti-war rally, and said that this war in Iraq is the fault of the Jews. A United States representative in the Congress said that. And he was then demoted from his leadership position by the Democrats and roundly castigated for what he had said. But the reality is that anti-Semitism is a prevailing piece of American cultural life, among Christians especially. And it's deeply rooted within church structures and within theologies. And so we have to be careful. People who are Christian have to be very careful to make sure that, we aren't just by accident, by that sort of cultural drive that we grew up in, sort of falling into that trap easily, as we sometimes do. So I think what I'm urging is that as individuals, we be very cognizant, very aware of our own cultural and racial baggage, if you will, our own theological, religious baggage, that we be very careful about understanding how racism and anti-Semitism is freed up in this society in very ugly and vile and potentially violent ways, that we be very clear and creative about how we respond to this reality in our midst, that we do everything we possibly can whenever we see it to respond to it, to counter it. One of the most difficult challenges we face in all of our organizing work is in communities where people say, well, yeah, I know that racist group is coming to town, but if we just don't say anything, they'll go away. My friends, that is not the way it happens. Silence is complicity, and silence is an invitation. Anytime you're silent in the face of this kind of racism or anti-Semitism, you're basically giving it room to spread and to grow. And that's the only reason these guys come into our towns and our communities and our cities, is to try to see if they can grab a couple of adherents here, a couple of new disciples there, and build a little group here and there that eventually may be 6, 8, 10, 15, 20 people that eventually then becomes a very strong and potentially violent presence within the life of our communities. We have to speak up and to speak out every time this stuff is in our face, every time we even hear about it, every time we think it may be here. We have to speak up. We have to get at the heart of what it is. We have to get at the heart of the ideology and the framework of race and anti-Semitism that often drives it. We have to take an active role in making sure that it does not take root in our communities. We have to stand up to it, because if we don't, then the kind of democracy and the kind of vision we have as a people in this nation will never come to fruition. We have to build democratic communities where social and economic and racial justice and opportunities really are available and for every person, no matter who they are, no matter what their heritage is, no matter where they come from, no matter what their race is, their religious identity, or anything else. And that's the real task we have before us in this nation in this coming century, is to build those kinds of democratic communities where that kind of opportunity and possibility is open for every person. And I hope that as you go from here this morning, as you continue your work, your studies, whatever you may be doing, that you will keep that in mind, that one of the fundamental tasks, no matter what our vocation is, one of our fundamental tasks in this point in American history is to make sure that we can develop those kinds of democratic communities where the people have real opportunity and real possibility for a viable future, and where we can all live together as one people, no matter who we are, no matter where we come from. That's the challenge I would give to you today. That's the challenge you have to live with here in northern Idaho, given the history of the Aryan nation. And that's the opportunity we all have to make sure that we give everything we possibly can of ourselves and of our lives and of our efforts and our energy and our funds and whatever else we can give to make sure that we build that kind of democratic society that each one of us in one way or another yearns deeply for. Thank you very much.
I would very much like to thank Reverend Dave Orstendorf of the United Church of Christ in Chicago for being with us and for his enlightenment on this topic. We have a lot of other things going on today, and we have to leave the auditorium because they're preparing for the diversity dancers. They're here from Seattle, and it takes from now to 1 o'clock to get them set up. And so I hope you'll come back at 1 o'clock. They're a beautiful group of dancers to dance on diversity, and we'll see you at 1. Thank you.